These are the lecture notes for Chapter 5, the integumentary system. I'm going to skip through the learning outcomes, although I encourage you to read them in the slides that are posted on Moodle as well. We're going to start with just an introduction to the integumentary system. The integumentary system consists of two major parts, and sometimes we just simply call the integumentary system the integument. But the major part is the cutaneous membrane, which is just another word for the skin. We learned that back in Chapter 4. And along with the skin, the integumentary system contains the accessory structures, hair, nails, and then exocrine glands like sweat glands and oil glands. The cutaneous membrane, or the skin, consists of two layers, and that would be the epidermis, which is the superficial layer, the layer on top, and the dermis, which is the layer that is deep to the epidermis, or underlies the epidermis. Below the dermis is the hypodermis, but it is technically not a part of the skin itself. But we do learn about it in this chapter because it is so connected with the skin, But the hypodermis is also called the subcutaneous layer, meaning below the skin. It is composed of loose connective tissue, areolar and adipose primarily. And what it does is it separates the integument from the deeper tissues like muscle tissue. Okay. So we've got epidermis, then dermis, and then the hypodermis, which is underneath. And this is a good, this shows you the major features of the integumentary system in this illustration. So we'll start with the layers of the cutaneous membrane. So the top layer, the epidermis, remember, is composed of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. And that's going to go from the very top keratinized layers all the way to the stratum basale, which is in this kind of bluish purple layer here. And the epidermis ends at the purple wavy line here. Then we have the dermis, which is composed of the papillary layer, which is the superficial layer, and the reticular layer, which is the deep layer. If you'll recall, the papillary layer is composed of areolar tissue, and the reticular layer is composed of dense, irregular connective tissue proper. Below that, the subcutaneous layer, or hypodermis, is shown here, and you can see all of the adipocytes and adipose tissue. Okay, the accessory structures, you can see the hair shaft, which is the portion above the skin, the hair follicle, which extends down into the deeper layer of the dermis. The erector pili muscle is attached to the hair follicle, and when that muscle contracts, your hair will stand on end and you will get goosebumps or goose pimples, whatever you call those. We have a pore of a sweat gland duct. And then we have here a sebaceous gland, also known as an oil gland. We have a fine touch receptor that's in the papillary layer of the dermis. We have, a pressure receptor, which is in the reticular layer of the dermis. Got some nerve fibers and some sweat glands. You can see the sweat gland here and how it, if we follow it all the way up to the surface of the skin, there's the pore of the sweat gland. And also I want to point out some areas where blood vessels are concentrated. The subpapillary plexus is here, and it is basically a layer of blood vessels that are found between the papillary and reticular layer of the dermis. And then you have the cutaneous plexus, which is found here at the between the dermis and the hypodermis. 5 general functions of the integument. Of course, the skin provides protection, temperature maintenance by, sweating to cool, cool the body, synthesis and storage of nutrients, and specifically here we're talking about that the epidermis of the skin synthesizes vitamin D3 when exposed to ultraviolet light, and the dermis stores adipose tissue, so lipids would be the nutrient there. Sensory reception, so there are sensory receptors in the skin, and then excretion and secretion, which I wanted to make sure you understood the difference. When we refer to the process of excretion, we're referring to when glands excrete salt, water, and organic waste through sweat. And secretion would be, through sweat and oil. And then secretion would be, for example, the mammary glands secrete milk. Secretion refers to actually releasing a product like hormones, are secreted. Milk is secreted by the mammary glands, but excretion is typically referring to waste. All right, the epidermis first. We're going to talk about the layers of the epidermis. You will need to memorize the layers of the epidermis from superficial to deep. We know that the epidermis is composed of layers of epithelial cells, but specifically, we call that tissue stratified squamous. The epidermis is avascular, contains no blood vessels. The way that oxygen and nutrients get to the cells of the epidermis is by diffusion from the dermis. The deepest cells, which means the ones closest to the dermis, are the most active. Those are the ones that are actively dividing to replace the cells that are shed from the top or superficial layer. And you probably know this, but the outermost or most superficial layers of cells are actually dead. Most of the cells that compose the epidermis are called keratinocytes, and they contain the protein keratin, which is a protective protein. You do need to know the difference between thick and thin skin. For one thing, you need to know where it's found. The thick skin is only found on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. And there's 2 things you need to know about the thick skin. First of all, the thick skin is going to contain a layer called the stratum lucidum, and the thin skin will not have that layer. So the stratum lucidum, in fact, if I move on, I can show you here. The stratum lucidum is only found in thick skin. The other 4 layers that are listed here on this slide are found in the thin skin and the thick skin. But the other difference is that the stratum corneum, which is the most superficial layer, is very thick in thick skin compared to thin skin. And thin skin is found everywhere else besides the palms and the soles, and only has 4 layers of cells. All right, so here are your layers of cells, starting with the deepest layer, the stratum basale, which contains cells that are actually dividing to replace the cells that are shed from the surface of your skin. So we have stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum, and stratum corneum. These are the 5 cell layers of the thick skin, starting with deep, moving on to superficial. And there is a sentence, let's see, that you can learn starting with the most superficial layer. Just learn this one. Come, let's get sun, and this is one word, but you could put a little sunburned. Kind of a little funny sentence because that relates to skin, when you get too much sun. And I apologize about the messiness, but that's the sentence. Come, let's get sunburned. If you'll remember that, that's going to help you with the layers from superficial, this is the top layer, all the way to the deepest layer, okay? And this is just an image of the layers of the epidermis. It includes the stratum lucidum, so this is an image of like a tissue slice of thick skin under the microscope. All right, so we're going to cover all of the layers of the epidermis one by one, just go over some notes and some important facts about each layer. Remember, the stratum basale is the deepest layer of the epidermis. And because the cells are dividing there or germinating is more of a term that you hear with plants, but you can also sometimes find the stratum basale is called the stratum germinativum. And so this is the deepest layer of the dermis. It contains basal cells or germinative cells. And these are stem cells that still have the ability to divide. They're dividing to replace the cells that are lost from the stratum corneum. Also, cells that you're going to find in the stratum basale are Merkel cells, which are touch receptors, and melanocytes, which synthesize melanin, the pigment melanin, which gives pigment to your skin. The epidermal ridges are, you saw like a wavy line. That was a purple wavy line in the illustrations showing the epidermis and the dermis. So the epidermal ridges are, well, I guess you would say, yeah. Anyway, these are epidermal ridges, and then the ones that poke up are called dermal papilla. And the interlocking of the epidermal ridges and the dermal papilla is what forms our fingerprints. And the purpose of it is to increase the surface area for diffusion, because remember that the epidermis doesn't have a blood supply. So that folding in the dermis and the epidermis where they connect, that folding increases the surface area so that more nutrients and oxygen can get to the cells of the epidermis, the ones that are still living. So just remember that the ridges are the folds that fold down. And then the papilla, the dermal papilla, are the ones that kind of form bumps in up, toward the surface. So the ridges are depressions, and the papilla are extend upward. Okay. All right. And this shows you, here's your dermal papilla here, here, and here, and here, and then the epidermal ridges. Okay. All right, the stratum spinosum, under the microscope it looks spiny, and that's where it gets its name from. The stratum spinosum is directly above or superficial to the stratum basale. The cells here may continue to divide. They're not dead yet. They are keratinocytes. They're held together by desmosomes, which remember is the strong attachment that attaches the skin cells together, so that when you shed skin cells, you don't shed them individually, you shed them in sheets or flakes. And we find dendritic cells within the stratum spinosum. They have extensions. They are involved in the immune response. I'll show you a picture in a minute, but I guess they're kind of like macrophages for the skin, for the epidermis of the skin. Then we have the stratum granulosum, or grainy layer, because it looks grainy under the microscope. These cells do not divide anymore. They have stopped dividing, and they've started making the protein keratin. In the thick skin, the next layer toward the surface, or the next layer, the next superficial layer, I guess you would say, is the stratum lucidum. It's only found in thick skin. And then lastly, we have the stratum corneum. And this layer contains 15 to 30 layers of flattened dead cells that are packed with keratin. We call them keratinized or cornified, and they are bound tightly by desmosomes.